No, I think that renters are still going to see that their costs went way up under this rent control, under AB 1482. And if they were, I mean, if we can successfully educate the voting public that this would be sunsetting in 2030, then maybe we would see the voters say, no, enough is enough. We've got to stop this. We can't and suffer, and again, to your point with the CPI, we can't do 10% rent increases every year.
So I'm delighted to be with Christine LaMarca today. Christine is in the apartment industry here in San Diego. She's an independent owner, and she's also the immediate past president of the Southern California Rental Housing Association. And I'm excited to be speaking with Christine about this latest attack on the Costa-Hawkins Act, and that would be 2024 Justice for Renters Act that's going to be voted on in the November elections. Christine and I had fought together back in 2018 when Prop 10 came about, and that was my first foray into a political fight. And I really appreciated how organized she was. We did a great job. And we actually beat that, Christine. We beat it
Yeah,
60-40, which
40.
was a pretty big win.
Mhm.
So Christine, how you doing?
I'm doing great, thank you. Obviously, didn't want to see myself in this situation again, repeat. But now that we're here, we've got to pick up our bootstraps and get to it.
How is the latest proposal, the Justice for Renters Act, different from the previous two attempts?
So I'm going to start with just explaining what Costa-Hawkins does. So Costa-Hawkins was a Tenant Protection Act. It was put in place in 1995. It was a bipartisan bill that was put in place because of areas like San Francisco and Santa Monica, where they were seeing runaway powers of locally appointed boards and panels put together to control rents in those, particularly in those two areas. So I'm quoting Santa Barbara may have also had it, but I know for sure Santa Monica and San Francisco. So they, at the Sacramento level, they put together this bipartisan bill, and it was to protect renters. Okay, it would allow post 1995 construction to go on market at market rates, so it would continue allowing developers to develop and encouraging, just not discouraging developers from developing. And it would prohibit cities and counties from establishing local rent control boards. And those would have been appointed people to those boards, and it would have been at the expense of the city or county until they realized how expensive it was, in which case it would get passed through, obviously, to the owners of the rental properties, which increases costs and drives up the cost of housing. But thirdly, it allowed owners at the time a unit became vacant to reset rent to market. And that's where that vacancy decontrol versus vacancy control came in. So it gave vacancy decontrol. At the time somebody moves out, if that apartment happened to be well under market at the time that the tenant moved out, we would be allowed to set it to whatever the market would bear at the time of the turnover. If Costa-Hawkins were to be eliminated in November, we would be prohibited from, we could potentially be prohibited from a vacancy reset, or I'm sorry, a rent reset at the time of vacancy. And when I say potentially, as boards and councils become more left-leaning across California, and we've seen it throughout California, to areas that were traditionally more conservative or more balanced in their approach to local politics, if we see more left-leaning boards, the inclination to implement a rent control board is going to be more likely. So we would have to see a jurisdiction implement the rent control board, and then we would see these vacancy decontrols come into place as they put in the rules. But jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And I at one time knew how many local counties and city governments there were in California, but I want to say it's upwards of 300. So you could have 300 potential rent control boards, and I don't know how that cost would ever be managed.
Costa-Hawkins is important because it makes it illegal for them to do these things, put rent control
Correct.
boards into place to prohibit vacancy decontrol, which really affects our business, quite frankly. And I think that's why a lot of owners right now, a lot of investors right now are looking at what could potentially happen in November as a big issue. For instance, I'm selling right now, rents are extremely low. And if they want to get that property up to a point where it should be, they're going to have vacancies because they have to reinvest in the building. The building
Correct.
has deferred maintenance. It needs a lot of work, a lot of renovation that costs money. And then the fruit of that will be for the ultimate investor to be able to put that unit back on market at current market rates, and it will rent out immediately at those rates
Right.
because it was held so low because of the aged previous owners. They just, again, never raised their rents until some of these new laws come about. So the question is, potentially, does that mean that a city council or a board of supervisors in San Diego County could say, okay, Costa-Hawkins is gone. Now what we can do is we can say that there is a new measure in place that says you can no longer, even if you have a vacancy, even if someone voluntarily moves out of your apartment and
Mm-hmm.
they were paying $1,000 a month for a 3-bedroom apartment in San Diego, you can't put that unit back up to what the current rent would be and would rent out immediately
Right.
because we need it. And
Right.
the people renting it would probably be happy to pay it. That's going to be illegal. That could potentially happen immediately because
Yes.
a left leaning, or let's just say a tenant sensitive board of supervisors could decide they want to make a change. And you probably were listening. In fact, I think you were at the meeting. I was listening to it on the radio when during COVID in 2020, our board of supervisors was giddy in putting together immediate emergency rent, illegal, in my opinion, rent
Yes.
controls. Uh, and they were doing it flagrantly on the radio. And so these are going to be the same people that are going to be in charge of the entire market in San Diego County if this passes.
Really good analogy. That is superior. And you're absolutely right. We did have in fact, our local apartment association sued the county of San Diego over what they did because it was illegal and it was taking away under constitutional rights. It was changing how we operated our businesses without due process. And that was a takings case that we did bring up against the county of San Diego. But to that point, we've already got these people in place. To the same point that you're making, in the city of San Diego, we already see the tenant protection ordinance and we see the lengths that they've gone to protect tenants in the city of San Diego. And that we've seen the preparation that they've made to implement rent control, upon the demise of Costa-Hawkins. So, but I'm going to turn this back around. As much as our boards and our boards and our city governments may see the need to protect tenants, there's also a reality check that has to happen here, and there's a balance. They depend on the revenues generated by all sorts of industry. And right now, the California Legislative Analyst has analyzed the potential consequences of the if Costa-Hawkins were to go away. And they're estimating it in the tens of millions of dollars in lost local funding as a result of this. And don't ask me how that calculation has happened, but immediately when you're talking about the transaction value of a transfer of real estate, how that would impact the taxes on that parcel. Well, imagine that exponentially multiplied over the state of California, and it would have to be in the tens of millions. This would affect public safety, after school programs. It would affect our senior programs. It would affect your parks and recreation departments. This would have a very negative effect on the public, and it would immediately hurt our city and local governments as far as being able to keep up with all those other things that they've obligated themselves to. The
Well,
true function of government.
we're a coastal city, and a coast usually means that they have air that is filled with water, and it permeates these buildings. And these buildings are built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there is a lot of renovation, a lot of construction, a lot
Hmm.
of work that needs to take place on these properties. Certainly, a driver of our economy is the maintenance of these properties. So, as soon as, I mean, one of the most basic arguments is as soon as you're limited on what you can charge, and now you have to pay more for water, more for insurance, 4 times more for
Hmm.
insurance. on an annual basis. Your taxes have gone up, but you're not able to increase your income. All your expenses have skyrocketed. How are you going to do capital expenses on these properties? Is that what they're getting at as far as the amount of funding, or are you talking about funding coming from a different source?
Well, you mean as far as how the effect on the city and local governments?
Yes.
Oh yeah, there'd be a decline in revenue from all sorts of things, not just the tax revenue, because the diminishment of value on each of these properties would be nearly immediate. Is where I think that that calculation is probably stemming from. But I'm going to go back to your example of the property you're putting on the market where the rents are severely under market, and the likelihood of gaining or getting those back to a market rate for what they're charging for the rents is challenging. That owner opted to not charge higher rents or not raise rents on a regular basis, but they also opted to not reinvest money into the property or not keep up with the maintenance that needed to be done. So you say there's a lot of deferred maintenance. Well, that is, you're right, coastal communities or not, a lot of our inventory in San Diego County was built in the 80s and late 70s and 60s. It needs money. It needs money to continue to put that value into the property and keep up the property. And renters are demanding a higher quality standard of life. So in order to meet the renters' demand for a higher quality apartment, they want the stainless steel appliances. They want the quartz countertops and the brand new white soft close cabinets. They don't want the old stuff. And I can't disagree. I don't want it either. So I want to be able to provide that for people. But if I'm not able to keep up my costs, as my cost rise just operated on a daily basis, and that goes from labor to electricity to water and insurance, which are all skyrocketed. Trash has gotten extremely expensive. If I'm not able to keep my rents, even keeping up with my daily expenses, how am I supposed to set aside for renovations that are now running me? And this is on a pretty good budget or tightly managed budget. Renovations are around $35,000.
Wow.
And that's not counting my rent loss, right? So I'm losing that income for that period of time as well. So, and I know you know this.
Yeah, 35,000 doing pretty good numbers over there. I mean, I've heard as high as 50, 60,000. I've had new investors come in willing to put in $80,000 per unit to improve the living conditions of tenants in San Diego County, but you don't hear that side of the story.
Well,
Uh,
100%. And we're not doing, if we have to, we're lucky we don't have to, but in some of the properties, if we have to do electrical panel upgrades, and that as more electrical mandates come down the pike, we may have to do electrical upgrades in our properties. That will add 12 grand to each renovation probably. So,
Yeah, electrical panels, huge issues. Number one thing I hear about right now, especially when we're putting a property on the market, people want to know if the electrical, first and foremost, has been updated and upgraded. I understand insurance companies are now starting to require that.
right. They won't
You know,
insure
all these things cost money.
Some of them won't insure if they've got Cisco breakers and things like that, but that's
Right.
too technical of a conversation for today.
Yes.
Probably way
Yes.
outside my scope of information anyways, other than practical knowledge.
Well, and one thing I want to ask is uh, previously, AB 1482, as I understand it, did not include single family housing. Essentially, if it was duplex or more, then it would fall under AB 1482. And the duplex, if you lived in it, then it still wouldn't fall under it. So anything over 2 units, essentially, that was not built within the last 15 years would fall under AB 1482.
Yes, it's all subject to
Now,
rent control unless it's a separate parcel. So a single family home not owned by an LLC, or I don't know what the logistics are on that, but I don't fortunately manage any of those. But yes, there's just that one exception.
so
Well, there's
under
quite a
this
few
new
exceptions, but yeah.
under this new Justice for Renters Act, will that include single family?
Under the Justice for Renters Act, it will include now single family homeowners who are renting out their homes or their condominiums would be subject to rent control. They would not be protected by Costa-Hawkins anymore, and they have been.
That's
So
right.
you're talking let's talk about our military who invest in single family homes and they get restationed and they rent out their home here in San Diego. They are now subject to rent control. Mom and pop who have a condo that they rent out, they will now be subject to rent control and whatever the whim of that rent control board requires. So fees, rent registries, vacancies, registries, any of those types of mandates, which they may or may not be able to keep up with, because I know you probably know this as well as I. They don't just have you fax that in or stick it in an envelope and mail it. They expect you to be able to go online and fill out these forms yourself. Imagine a mom and pop owner with no sophisticated management skills keeping up with a local restriction or requirement. That is not recipe for success.
Yeah, we wrestled with that last year with the notice that they had to put for the tenant protection ordinance that had to go out to each and every tenant in the city of San Diego. And you're right. They're crushing the independent owner. They're crushing them, or they're
Yes.
making it so difficult for them to operate without a fleet of attorneys to handle these situations,
Mhm.
that they're just kind of throwing up their arms. And I talked to Bill Exeter a lot of Exeter 1031 exchanges about what is the volume of single family versus multifamily and investment property sales. He says there's always been way more single family property investment properties sold on an annual basis than multifamily. It makes sense because there's a lot more of them. But now all of those potentially could be under rent control and could be affected. And as you mentioned, back in 2020, when they had the illegal tenant protection ordinances that were eviction moratoriums for COVID,
Mhm.
military families were getting torpedoed because they would come back and they couldn't move into their own house. And this is probably a prelude of what it would look like under these new rent
Oh,
control
yeah.
acts.
It would be very difficult. We're already in San Diego proper. We are in a very difficult situation. And I know a couple who are very elderly, very ill. They have a triplex. He was a gardener his whole life. He lives on, they get Social Security around $800 a month, and then they live on a triplex that they literally, she was an Avon lady and he was a gardener. They literally depend on the income from that triplex for their existence in life. And that triplex during COVID, and then now with the TPO things, we've got similar situations going on. But under COVID, when we had one of the three not paying and we couldn't do anything about it, it was crushing them. They had to change their entire life, forego some of their medications. And they also help out a daughter who's got special needs, and she just had to figure it out on her own. But this was definitely hurting their family, and this was how they planned to retire without the government having to help them. But then the government came in and took that ability away for a bit. So it does create challenges for investors. It's not for the good.
So do you think it will help renters?
It's a really interesting question, and personally, I don't think so. As I mentioned earlier, I think renters today expect higher quality of living situations. I think they want the buildings to be maintained. I think that renters are intelligent. Renters understand that things cost money, and that in order to be able to reinvest in the properties and maintain them properly and provide glimmering pools and nicely paved parking lots and such, rents have to keep up with the cost of operations. And I do think today's renters are very hip to that. I think they don't want to see us go into the tenements of New York City. They don't want to see units pulled off the market because the owner can't afford to renovate the unit, and then that becomes unavailable to rent. So I think renters would suffer under this because I do think that there'd be a lack of available housing. There'd certainly not be the creation of new housing that we would like to be seeing in the state of California. You know that there's right now an estimated 3.5 million housing shortfall. So that'll stop. Whatever's in the pipeline will finish, and that'll be it. So no, I don't think it'll help renters.
So a housing crisis is definitely what we're in. More housing is what we need. 3.5 million housing units short. I had a podcast. My last podcast was with Joshua Ohl from CoStar Analytics, and he's able to really grasp all the numbers, and he's really good at going through and finding out the details. We had a big discussion on rent growth by region. In fact, rent growth is significantly down for the last, for all of 2024 compared to the past 3 or 4 years. COVID was an anomaly. There were 12 years of actually 12% rent increases, but those were people moving out, people moving around.
Mhm.
Now the average rent growth in the regions about 1 or 2%, 2% in the bigger markets like North I-15 corridor. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes over here. East County, 1%, and even some negative rent growth in downtown. So the question is the market doing what the market does? Is it, a free market that's not interfered with by well-meaning, well-intentioned people? I'll call them people, politicians, whatever you want to call them. Do you find that a free market will level off, much as kind of what we're seeing here in 2024, as prices did get high and now they're kind of cooling off because the demand is still there? However, the market's dictating and the tenants are able to move around, and there's a lot of which is causing the lower rent growth percentages.
I'm not even sure if I'm qualified to answer that question, but I can say from a very practical standpoint, our vacancies are turning faster for non-renovated units, so the lower priced units, and they're turning slower for the renovated units. So there's some constraints there on what the renters can actually afford. As far as it leveling off, or I don't see it decreasing. If I saw our costs decreasing, then I would maybe be probably wanting to just test out decreases. But I have heard instances now, which we haven't heard for, I don't know, probably half a decade or a decade, of rent incentives, which we basically have not talked about for years. So maybe that's the new, or maybe that's how the price levels out. I don't know, frankly.
So I guess my question, maybe let me rephrase it a different way. I might have complicated it. If you as an owner put a unit out on the market for $2,400 a month and it sits for more than a week, which is very rare, San Diego County, but let's say it does, you're going to lower the price to $2,200 a month to get it rented, are you not?
No, I'm not. I might sit on it another week, but I'm in a very unique situation where I can do that. The reason I'm doing that is because I do provide a lot of voucher housing, and I don't want my price on that particularly priced on that particular unit to go below what I would be charging the next person in the door. So it would complicate things for me on a reporting basis, but I might offer a move-in incentive and say, hey, I'm going to give you a $600 move-in bonus, and that would basically offset, right, a couple $100s a month for the next 3 months. It'll allow them to get established into the new place. Whereas maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought about an incentive because my units were renting so fast. I could rely on it being occupied within that week. But I think when we price extremely fair, and we also know what our market is around us. So I don't find myself having to make that decision very frequently. It has slowed down though, so maybe I do need to start thinking like that. Thanks, Doug.
Well, what you're saying is a good example of, because you have the freedoms to move around in your business and make those decisions yourself, you're going to do what it takes to get that unit re-rented with someone. Maybe you will slow it down a little bit and see if someone shows up, because it's
Yeah, I
still
might go
is
down to
San Diego County.
2350.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but the point of the example is, as an owner, you have the ability. If you're under restrictions, it's going to be even harder for you to make those choices, because you're going to have to go within the confines of whatever the rent controls are.
100%. That's a really good point. And the more complicated it makes it. And when I gave you the example of my vouchers, if I had an applicant come in from Section 8 to qualify for that apartment, and I had somebody who just recently moved in and was only paying 22, but I'm asking 24 for this, I'm going to have a very challenging time, with the government. So the more complications you make it, the more or less likely or the less able I am to make adjustments to what the market will bear. I'm more just tied into where I'm at.
So the unintended consequences, as I'm hearing you over the last 30 minutes, is the unintended consequences for the owners is that when you make it more difficult for them to have the freedom to run their business the way a free market environment should allow it to be run, it may make it harder on their tenants.
Yes.
In the fact that they may not have upgraded units, they may not have renovated units, and you may just not put the property back on the market because it might be better to just keep it off the market for a shorter period of time until the right tenant does come along.
100%. And that's the problem with these, the unintended consequences that we keep referring to. An unelected bureaucratic board could really make it very complicated for renters in San Diego or anywhere in California to find the housing that they need at the price that they want to pay or are able to pay. And it would be very difficult for owners to make the adjustments needed to keep up with the normal flow of a market economy, a market-driven economy. So I do think anytime that anything interferes with the pricing of a commodity, it makes it more difficult for the consumer.
Yeah, San Francisco is a good example of how rent controls don't work. New York is a good example of how rent controls don't work. So if Costa-Hawkins defeat is a recap, first of all, it's going to allow rent controls to be applied to single family. So now it affects everybody. Secondly, it would remove the ability for rent decontrol, which means a owner like yourself can't, or I guess better way to put it, an owner like yourself, when you have a move out, isn't incentivized to invest in the property because you'll be limited as to what you can raise the rent to. And then what is the third one on Costa-Hawkins?
The creation of your unelected bureaucratic boards and oversight committees that would be, basically making all of the rules or setting the rules for various areas and up to every single jurisdiction in California. And how are we even going to manage the cost of that? Or we can't manage the most of what we've got going right now. But that vacancy decontrol issue is really important, and I'm going to hone in on that. They're saying if you took a normal priced unit today and you put that out over 5 years and you compared it under vacancy control versus vacancy decontrol, the potential loss in revenue on that apartment is nearly $30,000 over the course of a 5-year period. Well, I just told you how much a renovation costs on a unit, and that's about $30,000. So if you're pricing to keep up with your cost of operation, but you're not able to accumulate any additional money, you're never going to have money to reinvest into that apartment. It's going to look the same way it does today for the next however long until they are able to save the pennies and scrape it together to renovate.
Tell us about the town hall meeting next Wednesday as far as the next step on how people can support the Southern California Rental Housing Association.
I'll tongue and cheek it at the moment, but we do need all of your support. Financially, we're looking at a $5 million raise. Across the board, we're going to be spending about $5 million. We're raising $5 million towards the fight. And so we're hoping for some donations, but mostly we're hoping to inform all of the people who are investing in real estate or have current invested real estate, multifamily or single family, to come out and really find out what this is all about and how it's going to affect them, from everything from the property taxes to the rent control boards to how it will impact our city governments, to your resale value and the actual diminishment in your portfolio value if this were to go into effect, or be repealed.
Excellent. Well, next Wednesday, June 26th, 10 a.m. at the Marina Village. I'll have the information description below. You'll find it on the Southern California Rental Housing Association's website. I'll be sending it out in my newsletter. And Christine LaMarca, thank you so much. I look forward to fighting together with you on this latest fight. And if you want to hear more, come out to the event next Wednesday. We're going to be sponsoring it, and we're looking forward to getting the word out. So thank you, and have a great day.
I appreciate your time.